It was the summer of 1944. The world had been at war for nearly 5 long, brutal years. Across Europe, the shadow of Nazi Germany stretched from the beaches of France to the borders of Russia. Millions had already died, and the fate of freedom itself hung in the balance. In the West, Great Britain stood as a lonely fortress of resistance, battered yet unbroken. Across the Atlantic, the United States had joined the fight, sending soldiers, ships, and supplies in a massive effort to turn the tide. And now, after years of planning and sacrifice, the time had come for one final daring gamble: the liberation of Europe. The plan was called Operation Overlord. The day it would begin would be forever known as D-Day. It was to be the largest amphibious invasion in human history, an attack across the cold waters of the English Channel onto the heavily fortified beaches of Nazi-occupied France. For the Allies, success meant the beginning of the end of Hitler's empire. Failure would mean devastation, the loss of tens of thousands of soldiers, and perhaps the collapse of the entire Allied dream. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, bore the immense weight of this mission. Behind him stood an army of more than 2 million men from the United States, Britain, Canada, and many other nations, each one ready to risk everything for freedom. But before they could storm the beaches, they had to plan, deceive, and prepare for a moment unlike any other in history. The world waited, the soldiers trained, and the invasion that would change history was about to begin. The road to D-Day began long before the first soldier stepped onto the sands of Normandy. In secret rooms and underground bunkers across England, the greatest military minds of the Allied nations gathered to plan the most ambitious invasion in human history. They called it Operation Overlord, a name that carried both mystery and destiny. Every detail had to be perfect. Every ship, every tank, every bullet had to be accounted for. A single mistake could doom the mission, and with it, the hope of liberating Europe. At the heart of the operation was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, known simply as Ike. Calm, thoughtful, and respected by all, Eisenhower carried an unimaginable burden. He wasn't just commanding armies, he was deciding the fate of millions. The Allies faced a simple but impossible question: where to land? The French coast stretched for hundreds of miles, guarded by what Hitler called the Atlantic Wall, a vast chain of bunkers, cannons, and minefields meant to crush any invasion before it began. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had been tasked with strengthening those defenses. He ordered barbed wire to be laid across the beaches, steel obstacles to tear apart landing craft, and mines buried beneath the sand. The Allies knew that to win, they had to deceive him. Thus began one of the greatest deception campaigns in history, Operation Bodyguard. Fake armies were created across England, complete with inflatable tanks, wooden airplanes, and phony radio traffic. Entire divisions that didn't exist were stationed near Dover to convince the Germans the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Even double agents played their part, feeding false intelligence straight into the heart of Hitler's command. The ruse worked. Rommel concentrated his forces far from the true landing site. Meanwhile, real troops were preparing in silence. In vast training camps, soldiers practiced beach landings again and again, storming fake shorelines under live fire, learning to survive chaos. Engineers built floating harbors, known as mulberries, and pipelines to carry fuel under the sea. Hundreds of thousands of men and women worked around the clock: pilots, sailors, cooks, mechanics, and code breakers. Factories produced weapons day and night, while the Royal Navy assembled the greatest armada ever seen. Still, for all the preparation, one thing remained uncertain: the weather. The English Channel was known for its rough seas and unpredictable storms. For the invasion to succeed, everything depended on a few short hours of calm. As June approached, a fierce storm rolled in. Winds howled across southern England. Eisenhower gathered his commanders. The question hung heavy in the air: should they delay? His chief meteorologist predicted a brief window of improved weather on June 6, 1944. It was a gamble, one that could change history. Eisenhower looked around the room, his jaw tense, eyes tired but steady. After a long silence, he spoke the words that would echo through time. "Okay, let's go." The night before D-Day, June 5, 1944. Across southern England, tens of thousands of soldiers stood in silence, ready to embark on the greatest invasion the world had ever seen. The air was thick with tension, fear, and a quiet sense of destiny. In vast airfields and ports, lines of paratroopers checked their gear one last time. They carried rifles, grenades, maps, and small photos from home, reminders of what they were fighting for. Many were barely 20 years old. Some smoked in silence, others prayed. Letters were written in the dim glow of lanterns, final words to mothers, wives, and children, just in case they never returned. On the airstrips, thousands of planes stood ready. Engines roared to life, vibrating the ground beneath them. The men of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions of the United States and the British 6th Airborne prepared for their midnight drop behind enemy lines. Their mission: to seize key bridges, destroy communication lines, and block German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. It was a task of pure courage, to jump into the darkness, deep behind enemy territory, before the main invasion even began. As the order came through, one by one, aircraft lifted into the night sky. The sound of engines filled the air, a metallic thunder rolling toward destiny. Down below, soldiers aboard ships watched the sky flicker with lightning from the distant storm. Waves crashed against steel hulls. The men tried to sleep, but few could. Some whispered jokes to calm their nerves. Others clutched small crosses or lucky charms. On one ship, British soldiers sang softly, the tune barely rising over the sound of the sea. American troops shared chocolate bars, cigarettes, and nervous smiles. In his headquarters, General Eisenhower paced in silence. The weight of the world rested on his shoulders. He had written 2 speeches, one for success and one, in case of disaster, to take full responsibility for failure. The second speech, thankfully, would never be needed. At around 11 p.m., the skies opened. Rain poured across the channel, lightning flashed over the black water. But the order had already been given. There was no turning back. In the early hours of June 6th, the invasion began. Paratroopers leapt into the stormy darkness over Normandy. Many were scattered miles from their targets. Some landed in flooded fields, others in enemy villages. Gunfire lit the night sky as they fought desperately to regroup. Back on the ships, sailors and soldiers prepared for dawn. Commanders briefed their men. "We're going to liberate Europe. We're going to end this war." The channel was filled with more than 5,000 ships, carrying soldiers, tanks, and supplies, a floating city of war. Every man aboard knew what waited for them on the other side: danger, death, and the hope of victory. And as the first faint light of dawn began to break across the waves, one thought echoed in every mind: tomorrow, we fight for freedom. Just after midnight on June 6, 1944, the invasion of Europe began, not from the sea, but from the sky. The first wave of the Allied assault came in darkness, carried by nearly 13,000 paratroopers who leaped into the stormy skies above Normandy. The night was chaotic. Low clouds and heavy winds scattered entire formations. Some pilots dropped their men miles from their intended landing zones. Planes were hit by German anti-aircraft fire, lighting the night with fiery streaks of tracer rounds. The American 101st Screaming Eagles and 82nd Airborne Divisions, along with the British 6th Airborne Division, plunged into the unknown. Many soldiers landed alone, far from their comrades. Others were swallowed by flooded fields or tangled in trees and hedgerows. The darkness was alive with confusion. Radios crackled with broken transmissions. Gunfire echoed through the French countryside. Yet, amidst the chaos, small groups of paratroopers began to rally, sometimes just 2 or 3 men at a time. They had a mission: capture key bridges, destroy German defenses, and block reinforcements from reaching the beaches. One crucial objective was the Pegasus Bridge, held by the British 6th Airborne Division. In a daring glider assault, they landed silently just after midnight, surprising the German garrison and capturing the bridge within minutes. It was the first Allied victory of D-Day. Elsewhere, American paratroopers fought to take the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, vital for the success of the amphibious landings to come. In flooded marshes, men waded chest-deep through icy water, dragging equipment and weapons. Many never made it. Despite the confusion, the airborne soldiers achieved the impossible. They seized crossroads, ambushed enemy patrols, and created pockets of resistance that threw the German response into disarray. In the small French village of Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne found themselves landing directly into enemy fire. One soldier, John Steele, became famously caught on the church steeple, hanging helplessly for hours as the battle raged below. The town would become one of the first liberated in France. Throughout the night, the sky over Normandy burned with tracer fire, flares, and explosions. The men who landed there, often lost, cold, and outnumbered, refused to surrender. They formed improvised units, attacked enemy positions, and held their ground until reinforcements arrived. By dawn, though many objectives were missed and hundreds of soldiers killed or captured, the airborne troops had done their job. They had sown chaos behind enemy lines, severed communication routes, and prevented the Germans from organizing a strong defense at the beaches. Their courage, confusion, and sacrifice bought the Allies the most precious gift of all, time. And as the first light of morning spread across Normandy, thousands more men were already approaching the coast, ready to storm the beaches in what would become the most legendary battle of the modern age. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the largest armada ever assembled appeared on the horizon. More than 5,000 ships, stretching as far as the eye could see. Battleships, destroyers, landing craft, and transports filled the English Channel, all heading toward the French coast. On board were over 156,000 Allied soldiers, Americans, British, Canadians, and troops from across the free world. They were cold, wet, and silent, listening to the rumble of waves and artillery in the distance. Many were seasick, clutching their rifles and staring into the grey mist ahead. The first light of day revealed the coast of Normandy. 5 beaches code-named Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each had its own challenges: cliffs, strong currents, hidden mines, and heavily armed German bunkers waiting above the shore. Before the landing craft reached land, the skies thundered with the roar of Allied bombers and naval guns. Battleships like the U.S.S. Texas and HMS Warspite unleashed thousands of shells, pounding the coastline in an attempt to weaken German defenses. But many of the shells and bombs missed their targets. The Germans, protected in reinforced bunkers and hidden positions, waited patiently for the landing craft to approach. At 6:30 a.m., the first waves of soldiers hit Utah Beach. Strong currents had pushed them nearly 2 kilometers off course. But this accident saved lives. The German defenses were weaker there, and with courage and quick thinking, the Americans secured the beach by noon. Further east, on Omaha Beach, it was a very different story. As the ramps of the landing craft dropped, machine guns opened fire, bullets tore through the air. Men fell before they could even step into the water. Those who survived found themselves pinned down, trapped behind steel obstacles and barbed wire. The beach was a nightmare of chaos, waves tinted red, smoke rising from burning vehicles, medics shouting over explosions. The first waves suffered terrible losses. Entire companies were wiped out within minutes. Yet, amid the terror, acts of extraordinary heroism emerged. Small groups of soldiers crawled forward, using anything for cover. Engineers cleared mines under fire. Officers rallied whoever was still standing. One commander famously told his men, "There are 2 kinds of people on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Let's get off the beach." And slowly, inch by inch, they did. Meanwhile, the British and Canadians faced fierce resistance at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. Houses, fields, and cliffs became battlegrounds. Snipers fired from church towers, tanks bogged down in wet sand. But the Allies pressed forward with determination. At Juno Beach, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division lost nearly half its first wave, but by midday they had advanced farther inland than any other force. On Sword Beach, British troops met German counterattacks, led by tanks of the 21st Panzer Division. But thanks to naval gunfire and brave resistance, they held their ground. By afternoon, thousands of men lay dead or wounded, but the Allies had gained a foothold in Europe. Behind them, supply ships poured in equipment: jeeps, ammunition, food, fuel. The beaches of Normandy were turning into a lifeline for the liberation of France. From the decks of command ships, Eisenhower and his generals received the first messages of success. "We are on the beaches." 3 simple words, but they carried the weight of history. D-Day was far from over. The beachheads were fragile, and the Germans were already organizing fierce counterattacks. But the impossible had been done. The Allies were back in Europe. As the sun set over the battered coastline, the once invincible Atlantic Wall had been breached, and the fight for freedom had truly begun. By the afternoon of June 6, 1944, chaos ruled the beaches of Normandy. But out of that chaos, courage began to carve a path forward. The first waves of the invasion had taken terrible losses, yet small groups of soldiers were slowly breaking through the German defenses. On Omaha Beach, where the fighting was fiercest, American troops clawed their way past barbed wire and concrete bunkers. Engineers used flamethrowers and explosives to silence machine gun nests. Snipers and medics risked their lives under constant fire to pull the wounded to safety. Officers rallied anyone they could find: infantry, engineers, even cooks and radio men. There were no neat formations, only clusters of men driven by survival and determination. Together, they began climbing the cliffs that towered above the beach. At the top, they stormed the German positions one by one. Grenades shattered bunkers, bayonets flashed, and within hours, the enemy's iron grip began to crack. By evening, the high ground overlooking Omaha was in Allied hands. On Utah Beach, General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of the former U.S. president, had landed with the first wave. Despite being nearly 60 years old and walking with a cane, he personally led his men inland, famously saying, "We'll start the war from right here." His calm leadership turned a mislanding into a success. British and Canadian forces fought their way off Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, pushing through heavily fortified villages. In the town of Courseulles-sur-Mer, Canadian troops cleared house after house in brutal close combat. They fought street by street, yard by yard, until the enemy fell back. Tanks, once trapped on landing craft, began to roll ashore. The Allies' floating harbors, the Mulberries, were being towed across the channel to provide vital supply lines. Thousands of tons of ammunition, vehicles, and food were unloaded within days, turning the beaches into bustling lifelines of war. The Germans, shocked by the scale of the invasion, scrambled to respond. Their high command hesitated. Some believed Normandy was only a diversion. Rommel himself was away visiting his family when the landings began. By the time reinforcements were ordered, it was already too late. Throughout the night, Allied forces pushed deeper into the French countryside. The fields of Normandy, lined with thick hedgerows, became deadly traps where every corner could hide an ambush. But the momentum was unstoppable. The price was enormous. By the end of D-Day, more than 10,000 Allied soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. Yet the impossible had been achieved. The beaches were secured, the bridgeheads connected, and the invasion of Western Europe had begun. The soldiers who survived that first terrible day would remember it for the rest of their lives: the roar of the waves, the screams, the smoke, the smell of burning metal, and the knowledge that they had changed the course of history. D-Day was not just a battle, it was a beginning, the first step in a long grinding march across France toward the heart of Hitler's empire. And now, as night fell over Normandy, the world's hope rested in the hands of those who had endured the storm. As darkness fell over Normandy on the night of June 6, 1944, the Allies held a fragile victory. The beaches had been taken, but they were far from secure. Behind the sand dunes and cliffs lay a maze of villages, hedgerows, and narrow roads, all crawling with German resistance. The success of D-Day now depended on what came next: holding the ground and expanding the beachhead before German reinforcements could strike back. All through the night, the beaches came alive with the thunder of machinery. Bulldozers pushed wreckage aside. Engineers built makeshift roads and bridges. Medics worked tirelessly under dim lights, treating thousands of wounded soldiers. The smell of gunpowder and diesel filled the air. Offshore, the Great Armada continued to unload supplies. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, and crates of ammunition rolled onto the sand. By dawn, an entire logistical miracle was underway, the beginning of a floating city built to sustain an army. At Utah Beach, American forces linked up with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, who had fought fiercely through the night to capture key roads and bridges. Together they began their push inland toward the town of Carentan, a vital junction that connected all 5 beaches. On Omaha Beach, where the cost of victory had been highest, soldiers dug defensive positions and prepared for the inevitable counterattack. The once barren shore was now littered with tanks, trucks, and medical tents, a grim monument to both courage and sacrifice. Meanwhile, British and Canadian troops advanced from Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, fighting through a landscape unlike anything they had trained for. The Normandy hedgerows, thick earthen walls covered in tangled vegetation, turned every field into a fortress. Progress was painfully slow, with every hedge concealing machine guns or snipers. In one of the fiercest battles, British forces moved toward the city of Caen, a crucial objective for controlling Normandy. The Germans, realizing its importance, fought bitterly to hold it, turning it into rubble before the Allies could take it weeks later. Despite constant enemy fire, morale remained high. The people of Normandy, frightened but hopeful, began to emerge from hiding. They offered bread, water, and wine to the liberators. Some wept. Some waved small Allied flags they had kept hidden for years. The liberation of France had begun, one village at a time. The days that followed were brutal. Rain turned the beaches into mud. Supplies piled up faster than they could be moved inland. But the Allies adapted. Engineers built new roads, portable docks, and even a secret fuel pipeline beneath the sea, the Pluto Line, to keep the invasion fueled and moving. Every hour, more troops arrived from England, tens of thousands each day. The narrow beaches grew crowded with men and machines, all pushing toward a single goal: breaking out of Normandy. The Germans launched counterattacks with tanks and artillery, but Allied air power ruled the skies. Whenever enemy armor advanced, squadrons of Spitfires, Mustangs, and Thunderbolts swooped down to destroy them. Within a week, the Allies had landed more than 325,000 troops, 50,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of supplies. A new front had been created, one that Germany could not contain forever. D-Day had transformed from a single day of invasion into a foothold for liberation, a living, growing army stretching deeper into France. And though the cost was staggering, one truth echoed through every trench and camp. They were finally back in Europe, and they were not leaving again. By the morning of June 7, 1944, the thunder of battle still echoed across Normandy. Smoke rose from burning villages, and the beaches were littered with the wreckage of war: destroyed landing craft, broken weapons, and countless fallen soldiers. The Allies had done what many thought impossible. They had landed in France, faced the might of the German war machine, and survived. But the cost was staggering. In just one day, more than 10,000 Allied troops had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. Thousands more would die in the days that followed. German casualties were also immense. Their once proud Atlantic wall was in ruins. Many soldiers, cut off and surrounded, surrendered. Others fought bitterly from farmhouse to farmhouse, determined to hold their ground. For the survivors on both sides, the scenes were unforgettable. Medics worked endlessly, carrying stretchers through sand and mud. Chaplains whispered last prayers. The cries of the wounded mixed with the grinding of tanks and the roar of distant gunfire. In the small towns of Normandy, French civilians emerged cautiously from their cellars. Some wept at the sight of Allied flags fluttering above their homes. Others grieved for loved ones lost in the bombings. Entire villages had been reduced to rubble, but the people knew that freedom was returning. Over the next few weeks, the battle for Normandy raged on. The Allies fought inch by inch through hedgerows, farmlands, and destroyed towns. It was not the swift liberation many had hoped for. It was slow, grinding, and costly. The Germans launched desperate counterattacks, including the powerful panzer divisions. But they were met by relentless Allied airstrikes and overwhelming artillery. One of the bloodiest confrontations came in the Battle of Caen, where British and Canadian troops faced fierce resistance. The city was almost completely destroyed before finally being taken a month later. Yet, despite the hardship, the Allied advance could not be stopped. Each day, more men and machines arrived from England. Roads and bridges were rebuilt. Airfields were constructed in the open fields of Normandy. The beachhead had turned into a massive military base. By the end of June, over 850,000 Allied troops were fighting in France. The German army was being pushed back, village by village, field by field. Their tanks were running out of fuel, their communication lines were broken, and their morale was crumbling. On July 25, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, a breakout led by American General Omar Bradley. With a storm of bombers overhead, the Allies finally punched through the German lines. The road to Paris was open. Within a month, Allied forces had liberated Paris to the cheers of millions. French citizens filled the streets, waving flags, throwing flowers, and welcoming the soldiers who had crossed the sea to free them. The success of D-Day had done more than reclaim French soil. It had shattered Hitler's dream of domination. From that moment forward, the tide of war in Europe could never be turned back. And yet, for those who survived, D-Day was not remembered in glory, but in sacrifice, in the faces of friends who never returned, in the silence of the sea, and in the knowledge that freedom had been bought at a terrible price. As one soldier later said, "We were just ordinary men. But that day, we did something extraordinary." The story of D-Day did not end on June 6th, or even in the weeks that followed. Its legacy has echoed through generations, a moment when the free world stood together against tyranny, and ordinary men performed acts of extraordinary courage. The success of the Normandy landings marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. From those 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, came a tidal wave of liberation that swept across France, into Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally to Germany itself. Less than a year later, in May 1945, the war in Europe was over. But victory came at a staggering cost. By the end of the Normandy campaign, more than 425,000 soldiers from both sides were dead, wounded, or missing. The French countryside was scarred, its villages destroyed, its people forever changed. And yet, out of the ruins rose something powerful: hope. The people of Europe began to rebuild, guided by the belief that such horror must never happen again. D-Day became not just a military triumph, but a symbol of unity, courage, and sacrifice in the face of evil. Decades later, the beaches of Normandy remain sacred ground. The sand still holds fragments of steel and bone, and the wind still whispers the names of those who fell. White crosses and stars of David stretch across the cemeteries, row upon row of silent heroes who never returned home. Visitors from around the world come to stand there, presidents, veterans, children, and families, all drawn by the same quiet reverence. They walk among the graves, touch the names etched in stone, and listen to the distant waves that once carried an army of liberation. In speeches and films, D-Day is often told as a story of strategy and victory. But its true power lies in its humanity. It was a story of young men who faced fear and went forward anyway, of sailors who braved storm and fire, of medics who gave their lives to save others, of a generation that refused to surrender freedom, no matter the cost. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, reflecting years later, said, "We will accept nothing less than full victory." And they achieved it, not because they were fearless, but because they believed the world was worth fighting for. Today, D-Day stands as one of history's greatest reminders of what courage and unity can achieve. It is the story of light pushing back against darkness, of a day when the fate of humanity hung in the balance and freedom prevailed. As the sun sets over the calm waters of Normandy now, the beaches are peaceful once more. Children play where soldiers once fell. Birds circle above cliffs once scarred by fire. The echoes of war have faded, but the memory endures. And somewhere, in that gentle wind across the shore, you can still hear their promise: "We came here to set the world free."